Which came first, the abuse or the inner critic? Often when one of us becomes triggered or experiences anxiety about something, we will find that the resulting conversation triggers the other person as well. Such an incident happened recently when we, Wes and Ariel, were both triggered, and what we found at the bottom of this was essentially the inner critic for both of us. This sparked a conversation and some studying of the inner critic, and we came to some new insights we would like to share. A few more dots were connected, both on a personal level and on a cosmic level. If you have not done so, please consider reading the website and books by Dr. Pete Walker. Pete's web address is in the description box below. Pete specializes in helping adults who were traumatized in childhood, especially those whose repeated exposure to abuse and/or neglect left them with the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Pete Walker delves into the inner critic with detail and suggestions for how to deal with it and overcome it. What is the inner critic? The inner critic is that voice you hear inside your mind that tells you that no one likes you, you are ugly, you are stupid, you can't do something, etc. Some call this voice the devil on your shoulder. The variety of things that abusive voice tells us is relentless and unlimited. We may be able to recall our father, mother, partner, or friend having said the same thing, in which the inner critic just parrots back to us. However, at some point, the inner critic changes and becomes a sovereign entity existing inside of us, at which point the abuse switches from you are to I am. This makes it very hard to distinguish where these concepts are coming from, and we assume these are our own thoughts due to the I that the inner critic is now identifying with. The inner critic then begins to abuse us with thoughts of its own. Maybe no one ever told you that you are worthless, but somehow the inner critic has gained a vocabulary and is able to develop its own phrases and conditioning through which it uses to further suppress and injure our soul. How does this happen? Is the inner critic something that we develop, or has it been with us all along? When we examined what our inner critics were telling us during this triggering event, we both realized that because of the nature of our relationship, we could acknowledge these abusive statements as lies. For example, to be in a safe and secure relationship in which we know the other partner loves us, supports us, and is never leaving, and then to hear the inner critic say, she is rejecting you, and if you don't do this, she will no longer love you, or blatant falsehoods and downright lies. Why would we tell ourselves these things when we know they are not true? The bottom line is we wouldn't. Why would we abuse ourselves in such a way? We wouldn't. Upon further examination, we realized that these abusive statements were not coming from the true nature of our being. This was something separate. This was as if there was an other being inside of us intent on suppressing, injuring, and continuing the pattern of abuse that we received in the external environment, only this was internal, and it didn't belong there. As within, so without, right? While researching and contemplating the material for the West Penry papers, it was made known that the AIF did not take anything away from us when they created this specific body-mind-soul construct. The idea that we have reduced capacity or that we are somehow deficient in our faculties and abilities is false. Rather, it was that they added something to us that does not belong. This something is designed to create inner conflict within the individual. What this addition is, specifically, was not made known, but we are left to ponder and figure out what it could be. Could the inner critic be the thing that does not belong and was added? Throughout our experiences and learning about relationships and abuse, We had previously determined that the wounds came first and the inner critic was born from repeated abuse. What if it's the other way around? What if the inner critic is part of our inherent makeup? What if this is the narcissism seed that is implanted within us all, and that is why everyone is narcissistic to various degree? What if, in the creation of this body-mind-soul, there exists a tiny spark of AIF fire implanted in all of us? What better way to control a human population? In a collective group of beings that were intended to be slaves, what better way to control them and ensure they keep being slaved than to put the slave master inside them so that they essentially keep themselves in prison? Isn't this what we are doing? Do you see the prison guards running around on this planet, keeping everyone in line and keeping them controlled? No. So what makes us slaves to this system and keeps us agreeing to our own imprisonment? Fear. What ultimately ensures that we will remain in a constant state of fear? The inner critic. Who or what is on this planet to make sure that the inner critic gets fed and remains an active part of the human body-mind-soul complex? Narcissists. Can you see the picture? Think about who you would be if you did not have the voice of the inner critic inside you. Now let's look in more detail at narcissists, psychopaths. They are a different breed altogether. As we have discussed, narcissists seem to be something other than us. They also seem to be here as an agenda of some sorts. They are so carefully inserted within our human soul group that they are almost imperceptible without careful observation and awareness. The only guaranteed way to protect yourself from their abusive manipulation tactics is to have no contact whatsoever, none. They are such a dangerous lot that to simply engage them in any way is to risk abuse. We know that narcissists cannot ever be changed or healed. They simply do not have the ability. Where does healing come from? The soul. We, contrary to them, have an ability to connect with a higher self. If a higher self is a quality of the soul, then we can confidently say they lack a soul. So what animates the body of these people? In previous videos we discussed that narcissists are composed of fragment soul parts that are then pieced together to have enough soul energy to animate the body, but that's all. We assumed that this is why they need to feed from the energy of other people to be sustained. We still agree with this. However, when we take a look at what the inner critic says and the way it makes us feel, isn't that the role of the narcissist? Isn't this what they do to us? According to Pete Walker, when someone is triggered, or what he calls experiencing an emotional flashback, under MRI observation, the event is concentrated in the right hemisphere of the brain. The left brain, the part that controls logic and reason, becomes inaccessible to us. This is fascinating information. It shows a scientific explanation on why when we are deep in our wounds, we cannot simply get over it or reason with ourselves in a logical way to pull ourselves up and out of our emotional state of being. From a logical standpoint, we know we are fully capable adults. However, while experiencing an emotional flashback, we interpret the situation as if we are still a child. The rational part of our thinking process has been cut off. It is also known under the same MRI evaluation that the inner critic aligns itself with the right hemisphere of the brain. We cannot reason with our inner critic, and it doesn't respond to logic. When we try, we engage our inner critic in a difficult battle in which the inner critic is intent on winning. How then do we silence the inner critic? First, we recognize that any thought we have about ourselves that is hurtful, criticizing, devaluing, and shaming or blaming is the inner critic. We need to pay attention to our thoughts and the things we are telling ourselves. We become familiar with what this sounds like, and so we can recognize it quickly. Once we have recognized it, we tell it to shut up. We call it out on its lies. When we hear the inner critic tell us something, we internally shout back, "That's not true." We find our anger. We become aggressively self-protective of our soul, and we disidentify with this thing that has been put inside of us. This is not us. This is something that has been added to us which does not belong. We reject it. We disagree with everything it says. This is the AIF. We call this thing out and keep it separate from our being. We can even give it a name. One of Pete Walker's names for it is terrorist. We then follow that up with positive affirmations for ourselves that counteract the negative and abusive words of the inner critic. Inner critic, you are worthless. Self, I am priceless. Then bring to mind someone in your life who thinks you are wonderful as proof to the inner critic that you have value. It can even be your beloved pet. The point is to prove the inner critic wrong. Some people have such a vicious inner critic that they have difficulty with this. If this is the case, find someone to show or tell you one thing about yourself that is pleasing to them. Use this as a start. The good thing is that as soon as you find one thing, the inner critic backs down, and very soon many more things begin to show just how wonderful and capable you really are. For more details on this practice, visit Pete Walker's website and read the article titled "Shrinking the Inner Critic in Complex PTSD." Sometimes many of us are uncertain whether it's the inner critic who is talking, or if the voice or thought we perceive is coming from our own core being. In reality, it's relatively easy to distinguish. If the voice thought tells you something that is not enhancing your expansion, it's always the inner critic, 100% of the time. If your thoughts tell you something that is enhancing your expansion and awareness, it's the core being who's communicating through the conscious mind. It's not the inner critic. The only thing the core being, the soul, is interested in is expansion and to increase awareness. One last thing to consider is the nature of narcissistic supply. Based on our observations and study of narcissists, they seem to be nothing more than this alien implant in walking, talking, and breathing form. They are the embodiment of the inner critic program. They do not have the ability to silence the inner critic that is in tandem with the wounds they suffer, because the only thing that can silence it comes from the core soul and true self, something they lack. We can't imagine a more terrifying and hopeless existence. Could this be the true nature and the need for a narcissist's constant seeking for admiration, attention, and affirmation? Is their entire existence a never-ending and insatiable search for external silencing of the inner critic? And in their mind, it's never silent. The inner critic may be something that we cannot ever be without, but with practice and ever-increasing awareness, it seems we can silence it and be less and less affected by it.